A Missouri judge on Friday acquitted a white former police officer who was charged with fatally shooting a black man and planting a gun in that man's car following a high-speed chase. But because we know a segment of society doesn't respect the rule of law, nor the evidence supporting the officer's innocence, protesters in St. Louis Friday night blocked highways, damaged public and private property, broke windows, threw rocks at the mayor's house and threw bricks at police officers, who responded by dispersing tear gas at the protesters. But in what really makes matters worse and is downright terrifying to see, the so-called protesters didn't just cause havoc in areas where there is merchandise to loot, like big screen TVs and Nike shoes. This time they took it upon themselves to try to storm the mayor's house, his very place of residence and where he and his family live. There was even a point where multiple of the would-be protesters were photographed armed with AK-47’s. This isn't at all surprising since the reason behind all this civil unrest is pretty much aimed at started race riots, which would probably lead to civil war since most Americans are growing wary of all this civil unrest caused by the left and its race-baiting paid operatives. Fox News reports. St. Louis protesters break windows at home of city's mayor after cops acquittal. Protests in St. Louis over the acquittal of a white police officer in the shooting death of a black man turned violent late Friday, as about 1,000 demonstrators surrounded the home of the city's mayor. Members of the crowd broke at least 2 windows at the home of Mayor Lyda Crewson and threw red paint at the brick house before riot police moved in to disperse the crowd with tear gas, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported. There was no indication that Crewson was inside the home at the time, the newspaper reported. Meanwhile, St. Louis police said 2 officers were taken to a hospital with injuries suffered from thrown bricks in the central West End district of St. Louis. One officer had a serious injury from a brick thrown at Kings Highway and Waterman, then a second was headed to the hospital as well, the city's police department said. No other information was immediately released. Former St. Louis police officer Jason Stockley, left, was acquitted in the December 2011 shooting death of Anthony Lamar Smith, September 15, 2017. St. Louis Police Department via Associated Press. The protests began Friday morning after a white former St. Louis officer was found not guilty of first-degree murder in the shooting death of a black suspect. That white officer, former St. Louis police officer Jason Stockley, said Friday that he understands how a video of him fatally shooting Anthony Lamar Smith after a car chase in 2011 looks bad to investigators and the public. But he said the optics have to be separated from the facts and he did nothing wrong. Stockley was found not guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Smith, who was black. The ruling Friday sparked hundreds of people to protest in St. Louis. Stockley told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that the burden of having to kill someone never totally lifts. The former officer said he was concerned for first responders and protesters and doesn't want to see anyone hurt over the ruling. He said he can feel for and understand what Smith's family is facing, but that he is not to blame. The St. Louis Police Department tweeted earlier Friday evening that the protests were no longer considered peaceful, as demonstrators threw bottles at officers, smashed police vehicle windshields, and largely ignored officers' requests to clear a roadway, ultimately leaving at least 4 cops with minor injuries. Stockley was charged with first-degree murder after he shot Anthony Lamar Smith 5 times in 2011 following a high-speed chase. Stockley said he saw Smith holding a gun, and felt as though he was in danger. A gun found in Smith's car only had Stockley's DNA on it, prompting the prosecution to allege it was planted. During the trial, Assistant Circuit Attorney Robert Steele said that police dashcam video showed Stockley saying he was going to kill this expletive, don't you know it, before shooting Smith 5 times. Stockley could have been sentenced to up to life in prison without parole. He left the St. Louis Police Force in 2013. The protests sparked concern for the city of St. Louis because violent riots broke out in nearby Ferguson in 2014 after Michael Brown, an unarmed black teenager, was fatally shot by a white cop. That officer was never charged and eventually resigned. St. Louis police said on Twitter that 13 people had been arrested following Stockley's acquittal, including one Friday morning. St. Louis activists warned of civil disobedience if Stockley were to be acquitted before the verdict was announced. Fears of unrest prompted the National Guard to be on standby, while several downtown businesses to send employees home early, including Wells Fargo Advisors and Nestlé Purina Pet Care. U.S. Bank closed 6 branches. Some schools closed early and postponed events. America has always been a peaceful nation. In fact, Before President Barack Hussein Obama's 8 long and dark years as president, no one really thought about race relations much anymore. And just the fact that Obama was able to win the 2008 election would indicate that America isn't racist, no matter how hard the mainstream media tries to convince us that we are. 12% of America is black, yet Obama won in both 2008 and 2012 elections in a landslide. So can we please stop with the whole race thing?